I was expecting to be running a game tonight, but it fell through. I have 3 players. I haven't played with any of them yet. 2 of them were going to be subject to car trouble and weren't going to be able to make it, so it was just going to be me and one other guy. So I canceled, and I'm looking at rescheduling it, maybe for next weekend. But I've kind of been thinking about D&D. I got back in town tonight from my work trip out to West Texas. I really like West Texas. Texas is originally my home, but the Trans-Pecos area is just absolutely stunning. It's very disappointing to me that the Davis Mountains is almost entirely in private hands. It is nearly equivalent to national park level scenery, and it's extremely quiet. Hardly anybody's there, but you actually can't get to a lot of it either because it's privately owned. It's owned by, it's parceled up into a variety of different ranches. So, I mean, I understand how it got to be how it is. I understand why it is that way, but it is disappointing. But as I was driving around from El Paso to Fort Davis to Del Rio to Uvalde to San Antonio, et cetera, I spent a lot of time in the car, and I was thinking about gaming a bit. And I've been thinking about undead. I love the undead. I think they're my favorite class of monster. I think they are just more iconic than dragons, frankly. But, you know, Dungeons and Undead doesn't have the same ring to it. But I prefer undead Nemesis much more than I prefer Dungeons or Dragons. So I guess I kind of prefer a fantasy game that's neither Dungeons nor Dragons, but yet is somehow kind of sort of Dungeons and Dragons. I know that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but I love adventures that really have a focus on undead. I think that one of the most popular and well-regarded campaigns for the 5th edition era is Curse of Strahd, which is, of course, the 2nd or even 3rd remake of the original Ravenloft adventure for 1st edition AD&D. I know it was remade in 3rd edition as the Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, and that was a pretty good campaign book. And it was remade again as Curse of Strahd for 5th edition. I think there might have been a remixed or revised version of Curse of Strahd that was released. I don't know. I haven't really paid very close attention. Anyway, the whole point of this is that this kind of gothic horror with a vampire as the antagonist is super cool. Who doesn't like that? It's been very popular. It's been very well received. Frankly, I think it's probably been more popular and more well received than the Tyranny of Dragons or Dungeons of the Mad Mage or whatever else that focuses on the so-called iconic elements of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. I was also thinking about the Skinsaw Murders, which is the very second adventure of Rise of the Rune Lords, which was the very first Paizo adventure path after they kind of went solo. They had done adventure paths under the auspices of a contractor for Wizards of the Coast. They did Shackled City and Age of Worms and Savage Tides in the pages of Dungeon magazine. But then when they lost the rights to do Dungeon magazine because Wizards of the Coast wanted to pull that back in-house, they split and created their own adventure path. Rise of the Rune Lords was the first one. Skinsaw Murders was the second. It is one that has an awful lot of undead kind of stuff in it. It's got some ghouls that are running around hunting villagers that you need to help stop, and then you find out that, of course, there's a ghoul master, if you will, in a haunted house. And I think this is where Paizo invented the haunt mechanic, which basically is a ghostly kind of, it operates like a trap, except that its effect is essentially it's a magical spell, and it kind of has the skinning of a ghostly haunt to it. It's a really cool mechanic. I've actually liked them, and because they're open content, I took them pretty much, and because the games aren't I mean, even if they're not open, it's not like I can't take the same idea. And so I use haunts in my game, Dark Fantasy X, as well. I also have a lot of different undead types. But this is where I was kind of thinking about it, and I'm thinking about adapting Skinsaw Murders to be the first adventure that I run for this group that I didn't end up running for today. And I'm kind of thinking, do I want ghouls? Do I want wights? Do I want zombies? What exactly do I want to be the enemies they're facing? Because they're just first level characters. And it kind of occurred to me that I don't really care that much about the distinction between the undead. And then I had kind of thought this before, but I had specifically thought this more about the incorporeal undead, various types of ghosts and specters, wraiths, and everything else that are all conceptually the same. But realistically, the corporeal undead are also conceptually mostly the same. And there's too many different stat blocks that have too little meaningful variation. And there's really no point having all of these undead. Even if you use undead a lot, you can just have kind of a la carte menus of special abilities that you pick from and apply them to, you know, whatever template you want. It doesn't really matter what the basic stat block is. It maybe depends more on how challenging of an encounter you want it to be, rather than, quote unquote, what type of undead you want it to be. So it kind of occurred to me that I don't really care if they're wights or ghouls or zombies. I don't really care to necessarily make a distinction between them. So I thought, if I'm going to do kind of a la carte buffet special abilities for undead, I do still need to have a few conceptual frameworks, baselines to start from before you start to layer on different special abilities. The first one, of course, is the haunts. I think the haunts are kind of like the echo of something that happened before. They're not actually undead. They're more poltergeisty. They're kind of, so Jim Butcher put it best in the Dresden Files. Ghosts are not the spirits of the dead. They are psychic echoes of something that happened to a dead person that is still floating around up there. So that would be kind of the first level. Next, we have the incorporeal undead. These are various ghosts, specters, aleps, shadows, wraiths. At the most powerful, you probably get somewhere right about equivalent to the ring wraiths. But you can also have much more lower powered ones. Although in a lower magic setting, ghosts are always going to be difficult because you can't really damage them directly very easily. I kind of took a page from the Supernatural TV show, where for the most part, most ghosts are dispersed, exorcised, whatever you want to call it, by finding their grave, pouring salt on their bones, and burning them, and that makes the ghost go away. But you know, you could have other things that some ghosts are maybe more difficult to get rid of than that. That's not sufficient. Sometimes that would happen in the Supernatural show too. They'd dig up a grave and burn some bones and pour salt on it, and it still wouldn't work. But I think that in general, all of these ghosts can be the same, and you can make them more or less powerful. You can have more or fewer special abilities. These can range from a variety of different things, like a wraith's touch that kind of drains your life, to a banshee's scream, to the ability to cast a bunch of spells like a ring wraith maybe, and that would be the incorporeal undead, and that's kind of a class unto itself. Next, you have the corporeal and mostly free-willed undead, although I think that maybe there's a trajectory that an individual goes through here. And I think I have basically two trajectories. One that starts with something low level and kind of bestial and savage and almost unthinking, animalistic, like a ghoul, that can gradually rise up from that state to become more self-aware, more intelligent. They can become more powerful and still retain their animalism, and maybe kind of even become more animalistic, maybe take on like gigantic bat features of some kind or another. But if they can wrangle themselves back into a sense of lucidity or sanity, this is the path that eventually becomes vampires. And vampires are essentially immortal. I mean, they can be killed, but they don't die of old age. They don't even age. They are usually beautiful and very creepy predators. And that's kind of the way that they've been described pretty much since they kind of came out of the folklore and turned into the Gothic novels in the 1800s. Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course, is the most famous, but it had its predecessors, like Polidori's Vampire and some others that basically did a lot of the same things before Dracula did. And this is the vampire that is most well known to us. I actually like the idea, and I kind of am borrowing this a little bit from the more recent version of Warhammer, where there could also be savage, almost more like cannibal rather than blood-sucking vampires, but they're really kind of the same thing. It's just a question of how much civilization, lucidity, and I don't know how much of that can they claw back from their bestial urges and force themselves to at least resemble people. On the other hand, though, you have the corporeal undead that maybe start off as also not self-aware, and these would be, reanimated skeletons and zombies or whatever, that become more powerful as they move up into like barrow wights, again from Lord of the Rings, or mummies. And it also occurred to me, for that matter, what's the difference between a wight and a mummy, other than that barrow wights are kind of cold and seem to be associated with, ancient, maybe Bronze Age or even Neolithic Europeans, and mummies are sandy and hot and associated with ancient Egyptians. But other than that, they're conceptually exactly the same thing. These are relatively powerful undead. They're free-willed and self-aware. And these are the ones that are kind of on their way to becoming a Lich or a Death Knight, which, again, are also conceptually the same thing, except one is just more magical and the other is more powerful in combat. So we have basically 4 types of undead: haunts, incorporeal, ghosts, and all of their associated variations, corporeal bloodsuckers or flesh eaters that get their sustenance from preying on humanity. These are ghouls and vampires and various stages in between. And then we have kind of the skeletal types of undead that kind of start with kind of fairly lowly stuff, but also include wights, mummies, and at kind of apex you have the Lich. And then in Dark Fantasy X, I also have heresiarchs, which are kind of like merc sorcerers. They, in many ways, are people who, through their transhumanist magic, have incorporated most of the strengths of both vampires and liches and few of the weaknesses of either. They're supposed to be, of course, the most dangerous type of undead that exists. And you don't actually fight them. They're kind of more plot devices rather than, actual antagonists for the most part. I really find them to be more akin to the 10 who are taken from Glenn Cook's The Black Company than anything that's in D&D currently. So, I don't know, as I was thinking about this, I thought, hey, this is maybe the best way to deal with undead. Let's have them just kind of be in general categories and not worry so much about what exactly is the type here. If I need a special ability, I'll grab one. I'll grab it out of D&D even and just use it in my game. Or I'll use one of the stats that I have, but I'm not going to worry too much about exactly what type of undead it is. I do kind of like the idea. Now, obviously, a sorcerer who wants to become a lich at the end of his life is not going to start out his undead journey as a skeleton and work his way up to lich. He's going to, jump straight to, something that's either a lich or close to a lich. And the same thing with, maybe one who wants to become a vampire. Maybe doesn't have to go down and be a mindless ghoul first. Although maybe that's kind of a curse that can happen to them, and maybe that's how the first vampires were started, is they first were cursed with becoming ghouls, and then were able to claw themselves up to becoming vampires. So anyway, this is maybe a little bit rambly, maybe a little bit lore-ish, and I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I kind of have this idea about undead, this grand unified theory of undead, that, you know, maybe there's not like all of these different types of undeads, but there's basically just like a handful of types of undeads, just 3 really, because the haunts aren't really undead. So there's ghosts, and then there's vampires, and then there's liches, and then there's the various stages of undead that are kind of on the same track as those, but those are kind of the top, the peak, if you will, of that track, the end result. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and, you know, I love undead. What can you say? As we're in October now, and it is coming up on Halloween, it's even more appropriate to think and talk about them, I think, but I always like them. They're always my favorite monster type.